all segments of Nigeria. And again, the nature of the training tended to focus more on the traditional European type of colonial education, which was aimed at developing a manpower resource base that will service or that will provide services for government, rather than building an education system that is industry-based, that is based on skills development, and that is based to that is directed and at unlocking the human capacity within Nigerians. Secondly, the agricultural sector again was neglected, and there were little investments in infrastructure, in equipment and machinery. And the fact that the Nigerian power sector, energy sector was inadequately developed over the years, it's affected the industrial sector. So the linkage between agriculture, industry was lost. And therefore, the country began to rely heavily on imports of all sorts of things, including agricultural machineries. And this stagnated the mechanization of agriculture in the country, leading to very low yields per unit of land. And again, which dragged a lot of young Nigerians to begin to see food production, engagement in agriculture as not a lucrative business, and therefore the level of investments in the sector declined. So largely still, the Nigerian agricultural system remains subsistence, low input utilization, and therefore very low level of productivity. And the fact that the vast majority of Nigerians rely on farming, this explains some of the high level of poverty, unemployment, and low productivity of the sector.
Okay. But if you go way back, you say majority of Nigerians rely on agriculture, but if you remember correctly, with what has been happening in the past few weeks, what has been happening to farmers, people are no longer going to farm, people are running away from their farms because, of course, nobody wants to be killed. The history of banditry between farmers and herders go way back. It's not something that started today. So I just need to understand, I know you've been in this space for some time. What do you think is the cause of the change between, there was some sort of cordial relationship between these two communities, but all of a sudden things changed. What, from your own understanding, what do you think is going on? If you don't mind, Dr. Sally, can you turn on your camera? We're still, it's from your own end, it's not from us here.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think it's now okay.
Yeah, it's better now. Yeah.
To look at these issues that you have just mentioned and to put it in perspective, like you rightly said, relationships among different resource user groups, not only pastoralists and farmers, but many other resource user groups, was very cordial. And it also extended to nearly every segment of the Nigerian society. But with weak governance at the local level, with poor administration of natural resources, utilization and management, led to a lot of challenges. And for me, this has its origin from the 1976 local government reforms, when the native authorities and the systems of government, particularly in northern Nigeria, was changed and local governments were created. The new set of personnel, the new set of players within the local government administrations and the state government were inefficient in managing relationships and in coordinating the use of the critical rural resources, namely land, water, and forest. And this explains not only the degradation of key environmental resources in northern Nigeria, such as deforestation, loss of soils, but also degeneration of grazing areas and the increasing degradation of the cropping lands. And the fact that the utilization of these resources is not well coordinated, it allowed for all sorts of encroachment. Coupled with the very weak mechanisms for the management or resolution of those resource use conflicts, particularly due to the inadequate understanding of the nature of rural relations among the Nigeria security establishment and judicial system led to judgment or decisions by security agencies that were inimical to cordial relationships. The traditional institutions that effectively manage interrelationship between these groups were taken to the background, and therefore the new players in the administration of rural government, the management of resources failed to do it. And that's why today we are seeing that our forests are occupied by criminal groups, our grazing areas are degraded, our farming lands, very low level of productivity, and relationship between various resource user groups is very poor. And all these are precipices for various forms of violent conflict.
All right. Similar to that, I know PARI has carried out extensive study in Zamfara State. I just want to hear your view from the findings and you've made so far. There seems to be this kind of relationship between what is happening in Zamfara State that is spilling over to Katsina, Niger State, Sokoto, and as well as Kaduna. So from your findings so far, what exactly do you think is going on in Zamfara State or the Northwest in general?
The challenges in the Northwest actually have a very long history, and people generally do not tend to see it over this long period of time. And I think it started. I'm
wondering where that sound is coming from. Can you hear me?
Yes, and I think it started particularly in the early 1990s, when armed robberies along major highways started in the country. And there was inability to effectively deal with that. And criminality generally grows and changes pattern with changing practices, with changing policies and changing environments. So the inability to manage or deal with criminality in the form of armed robbery, first on the highways, then it moves to the urban centers in many of our cities. And by the early decade of 2000, there were already very strong armed groups who were carrying out their activities. If you could all recall, in the middle of around 2003 to 2004, 2005, you can all recall the popular banking reforms in Nigeria. And very few people have linked what happened within that period to the transformation of crime. And what happened was, with the banking...
I don't know, that sound that's coming from your background, is it something you can find a way to resolve?
Okay.
Yeah, it's better now.
It's better now, but certainly maybe not from my own end.
Oh.
Okay. Now, if you look at it from the banking reforms, there was a lot of consolidation in the banking sector, and a lot of people stopped carrying cash when they are traveling, and they stopped keeping cash in their homes, and they stopped keeping cash everywhere, because you can easily move from one city to the other and just use the banking mechanisms to make your payments. Mm-hmm. So highway robbery became non-lucrative. When you go to the cities and you raid 10, 15, 20 homes, you barely get nothing in form of cash. And so criminality changed its form from armed robbery to collect cash into the confiscation of physical wealth that can easily be converted to cash in the rural areas. And the first was cattle rustling. So that was how cattle rustling emerged. And again, the institutions, the public, and everybody did not pay attention to that until nearly the entire livestock flock, particularly in parts of Zamfara State and southwestern parts of Kaduna, which is the popular Birnin Valley axis, nearly all the cattle there were rustled. And when there were no longer cattle to rustle, the criminals began to go to the villages, to raid the villages for work bulls, for sheep, for goats, and to extort money and valuables from households. Again, when that was exhausted, they borrowed a leaf into the art of kidnapping from the Niger Delta, where militants were kidnapping people in the first instance to agitate for support for their communities. here it became kidnapping people for ransom. And with the of different gangs and the emergence of village vigilante groups to counter those gangs, inter-gang warfare also ensued, and the whole situation became complicated. So as we have today, there are different gangs, there are different groups of vigilantes, many of them also with some criminal tendencies and excesses, and all of this complicate the situation. And the fact that the Nigerian security establishment have two key challenges. One, inadequate training in the art of dealing with these forms of new crimes, and certainly insufficiency of tools and equipment to work in isolated rural areas, to deal with crimes in the forest, to deal with criminals that are highly mobile and not static in a particular location, has become the bane of the current situation. So what we witness some of these large killings are usually the outcome of inter-gang rivalry, the need to confiscate mass wealth from communities, and things associated with that.
I'm really struggling to hear. I don't know. I think the sound is still there, but we'll just see if there's something you can do around that to minimize that. But in line with what you just said now, are you saying that the kidnapping in the Niger Delta, in some way or manner, helped to reinforce what is going on in the Northwest?
Oh, certainly that's not what I mean. What I simply mean, what I was simply referring to is that crime and criminal activities, they learn from each other. You know, if you look at the situation in the Niger Delta, at the beginning, almost all the groups were kidnapping as a means of agitation so that the oil companies could provide support to their communities. So it was like an communal agitations. So you kidnap an expatriate and you use that as a bargaining power in the initial stages so that there is attention accorded to your communities. And quickly people recognize that if we can be able to kidnap one person and negotiate for a community, I can kidnap a person and negotiate for myself. And I think that was how it started. Then other criminal groups throughout the country were learning. And that's how it's expanded, just like piracy have expanded all over the world. That was how it's expanded to nearly all parts of the country. That's what I was referring to.
But do you think that's why we've not been able to, manage some of these issues? It's like whenever an issue comes up, government will just find a way to proactively react to the issues, but we've not been proactive about some of these things. Now, amnesty was given to the militants in the Niger Delta. Now, amnesty is being given to bandits in the Northwest. Amnesty is being given to repentant Boko Haram insurgents. Does it mean we'll just find whatever works somewhere, we'll just pick it, and without finding real evidence or solution to those things, we're just picking whatever works somewhere and then transfer it like a blanket cover for everything? Don't you think that's part of the reason why we are still where we are?
I think in my view and understanding and experience over these years, first, we need to recognize that there is a lot of misrepresentation of what is actually happening on the ground. And this has to do with two things. First of all, many of the institutions of government, including the security agency, these challenges are new to them. And unfortunately, there hasn't been enough training and capacity development for these agencies to be able to understand what is happening and to respond appropriately, and finally to communicate with Nigerians on what they are doing and how they are doing it and how they are going about it. If we take in every criminal situation like we have in the Northwest, first, we want many people to recognize that some of those people involved in crime were taken into criminal activities by force. So there's forced conscription. So in a situation where there is forced conscription and people have been able to escape from that situation of forced conscription and they have been able to find a way to interact and relate with their situation. What is wrong with accepting those people, rehabilitating them, and putting them back into the coast to become real and valuable citizens for the country? But the fact that it is always not adequately communicated, everybody thinks that whoever you see committing crime or going into insurgency or being a militant, when they are willingly, whereas there was a lot of forced conscription. That's in the first instance. In the second instance, in the cost of operations of criminal groups, in the cost of operations of the Nigerian security establishments, a lot of communities, a lot of individuals were unjustly treated to the extent that they have to flee and take refuge among the criminal groups themselves. And where you have a situation where those group of people have been able to escape from such situations or to renounce the contributions they have made, I do think that yes, there is a window of opportunity. And finally, what is the capacity of the state in itself to deal with some of these issues on a continuous basis and to bring an end to it? So I do believe that if you have willing partners, particularly from those groups that have noticed how wrong they have gone, I think the best thing is to give them a window, since we are unable to deal with them, let me say, through the use of force, then we need to use some of the soft approaches. And in either case, even in war situations, always, like they used to say, the war ends through negotiations. So where you have a large swath of people based on certain circumstances who find themselves in certain situations, negotiating and discussing with them and getting them to exit from those behaviors, I think should not be completely condemned.
So let me get you correct. You're actually saying that, okay, let's say Zamfara state government, did they actually give amnesty to bandits?
Very difficult for me to say outrightly yes or no, and very difficult for me because I have not been a direct party in some of the discussions and some of the negotiations. But from our work in Zamfara state, there were clearly 3, or let me say even up to 4 non-state actors that were involved in some of these some of the mass killings that we have witnessed, and in some of the insecurity that we have witnessed in Zamfara state. First of all, there are the true, like I put it, the full criminal groups whose intent is to commit criminality, who are basically criminals and who joined for the purpose of crime, like extortion, like kidnapping, and some of these crimes. That's first. Secondly, there were large arms of groups of village vigilante groups who emerged as self-help groups, who over time also converted themselves into authorities, who committed a lot of atrocities against other communities, against individuals whom they perceive as either aiding criminality or whom they perceive as supporting criminality or carrying out criminality, whether it is truly they do it or not. So the village-based self-help vigilante groups had also committed a lot of atrocities. The third group are aggrieved young people who were victims of the activities of criminal gangs or victims of the atrocities of village-based vigilante groups, or who were unjustly treated by security agencies in trying to respond to the challenge. And therefore, they had no succor anywhere. So they ran to the bush, they constituted themselves into gangs as well, they armed themselves, and they were also committing a lot of atrocities. But their key focus is not criminality, but maybe to revenge the perceived wrongs done to them. The third group are political thugs who are largely aligned to one political interest or another political interest, or to one political actor or another political actor. And they too, during political activities or for one reason or the other, have also committed quite a number of atrocities that collectively contributed to the state of insecurity. My understanding, when the Governor Matawalle administration came on board in May 2019, what he did was to call the vigilante groups to order, and he invited most of the
Hello, Dr. Mamale. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for the interruption, please. Okay, so like I was saying, what I understood is when the Matawalle's administration came on board in May 2019, we studied and analyzed the situation and called the two of the major actors, the village-based vigilante groups and the young people who were armed and who felt aggrieved, and he brought them together to a round table. He asked the vigilante groups to stop their atrocities and to no longer kill anybody, to hand over any suspect to the security agencies, and therefore he halted their nefarious activities. The people that were committing atrocities in the name of vengeance or revenge or for various forms of perceptions which they have, he also called them to order. And oh my God. Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you. Please go ahead. Continue.
He also called them to order and negotiated for them to stop the vengeance, the attack on passive enemies that was ongoing. So, and in the process, with the two groups coming together, they were able to substantially hold the criminal groups on check. But that is not to rule out 100% that part of those the government discussed with were also involved in crime or were not involved in crime. But principally, the two major groups that the administration addressed were the the armed village vigilante groups and the aggrieved young people that took up to arms in the forest. But like I earlier said, because both the handlers of the communication of the state government are not well trained to understand the dynamics and inform Nigerians more appropriately on what is happening, it was generally perceived that the administration was negotiating with bandits, and there was no clear demarcation among the various groups that the state administration was discussing with.
All right, thank you so much for clarifying that. But I have a bit of a concern. You know, before now, the North used to be the majority of the food that we consume in this country come from the North. Now people are no longer going to farm. Young people in the North are moving downwards, down south, because they need to be secure and then to find some source of livelihood. Nobody's going to the farm anymore in the North. What do you think? Where do you think Nigeria will be in the next, let's say, 5 years, or what is going on?
Thank you very much. First of all, you know, northern Nigeria is a very vast country. I mean, section of the country, very extensive. It's true that thousands of farmers have challenges of access to farms. There are a lot of extortion of farming and pastoral communities, both those producing livestock and cultivating crops in many parts of northern Nigeria. That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But that is not to say that the vast majority of farmers in northern Nigeria are not going to the farms. The vast majority of farmers in northern Nigeria are still able to go to the farms. but there are spots and parts of the north where there is high security risks. That's just to make that point clear. Secondly, if you notice, there have been a lot of displacements. And the land tenurial system in northern Nigeria, as well as the cultural practices among most people in northern Nigeria, has substantially assisted in limiting the adverse effect of this insecurity on farming activities. I give you an example. Farmers that are displaced from one location to another, upon arriving another part that is a little bit more secure, you find the host communities giving them lands, giving them new areas to cultivate, and accommodating them in ways that will really surprise many of us. So the people of northern Nigeria are highly accommodating to those relations or those sections of the society that are affected by some of this violence and insecurity. And I think that has substantially contributed in stabilizing the food shortages that we would have ordinarily witnessed. The third point is that many other, even the nature of the insecurity has not been static. It has been changing from time to time, from one location to another location. As the level of insecurity is increasing in a particular part of the north, or even in a particular part of the state, you find that other parts of the state becomes more secure and people are able to farm more. I can give you an example for in the case of Zamfara. If you look at the situation, for example, in Zamfara between 2017 to early part of 2019, if you look at some local, about 7 to 8 local governments in Zamfara were largely insecure and people had much difficulty engaging in farming activities. But again, if you look at it, for example, from 2019 to the present period, you find there is higher level of insecurity and lesser levels of attack on farmers and rural communities in Zamfara state, while the challenge has shifted to Katsina, where there was at that time more relative peace and stability. So today you find local governments like Jibia, Basari, Sabua, Paskari in Katsina state facing higher level of insecurity, while other local governments in Zamfara are enjoying higher levels of security. So it means that the capacity of the farmers has also been changing. So I think this has substantially assisted northern Nigeria to continue to produce food. But overall, it has huge impact on food supply, and it's affecting livelihoods, and it's affecting the overall security, food security of the nation. And I think collectively as a country, we need to sit together and work out mechanisms and ways of supporting our government to bring an end to this challenge.
Okay. In line with what you just said, what is good enough your advisor to the Honorable Minister of Agriculture? What exactly is the ministry or government doing to move agriculture from providing food for us to eat to seeing agriculture as a form of business?
If you look at the policy thrust in the agricultural sector, I think throughout this the last decade, there has been a lot of focus on commercialization of agriculture and promotion of private sector investment. And again, I think the government is substantially moving away from direct provision of inputs like they tried to do in the past, like fertilizers, like seeds, to promoting private sector investments in this critical sector. And again, one of the major challenges, like I earlier mentioned, is the issue of access to mechanization and access to agricultural machineries. And I think the current administration is strongly focused on the mechanization of the agricultural sector through the Grain Imperative Initiative. Like I earlier mentioned, a key defect in the sector is inadequate capacity, and so much attention is now directed at revitalizing the agricultural extension service, which will become an engine room for the provision of quality manpower that will be able to produce increase or to attain increased yield per unit of land with less labor and with less inputs. So these are critical issues that the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and the government of Nigeria is focused on. And I think many of the state governments have keyed into this initiative, and this is contributing immensely in stabilizing the food deficit within the country, notwithstanding the high food prices that are triggered by many other factors, not only the scarcity of food or the insecurity that we are witnessing, but also other dynamics of the economy, the foreign exchange stability, and other factors associated with that.
All right, thank you. Earlier you mentioned something, you mentioned the petroleum industry, but I think it's a good thing that we are coming to the end of the petroleum age. Maybe government will, pay more attention to the agricultural sector. But do you think will be fighting a losing battle, given that our population is on the increase? We have more competition for land and issues around the agriculture. Our population is increasing almost on a daily basis. So do you think it will be fighting a losing battle if, let's say, the petroleum age is over now, maybe by 2030? What do you think will become of us by then?
Certainly, there is a big challenge for the economy because government revenue substantially comes from the petroleum industry.
Yeah.
But if you look at the contributions of the petroleum sector to the national GDP, is comparatively far less than it is contributing to government revenue. So it is very important for government to strengthen the diversification of its revenue sources right from now into the future. Coming back to the population expansion, I do recognize it is a huge challenge, and it is something that Nigeria will have to deal with. That is undisputable. But available statistics up to this moment, if you look at some statistics, they say that Nigeria is just able to utilize about 35% of its arable land. Wherever we are, we have nearly 50% of Nigeria's potential arable land that is not put into intensive use up to this moment. So the key challenge, again, is not just about land, but the productivity of the land. If I own 100,000 hectares of land or 10,000 hectares of land, and I produce very little, then it makes little meaning. But what I can produce in 5 hectares, somebody can produce it in half a hectare. So addressing the challenge completely depends on how Nigeria and Nigerians invest in human capital development, invest in technology, and invest in scientific knowledge so that we can innovate, use the same land area to grow more crops and livestock than we are currently doing. I think this is where we should focus our attention on. And that is why the current agricultural policy under crafting in Nigeria is focused on innovation and technology. And I think if we're able to break that jinx by transforming the Nigerian agricultural sector technologically and increasing our productivity per unit of land, then Nigeria's population increase may not become a huge challenge in the future.
Okay, which brings me to the next question. Don't you think it's right time we amend the 1978 Land Use Act because majority of the land is supposed to be in the hand of government. If you check now, rich people have already bought almost the same, almost all the spaces you have available. Then you have rural farmers who are poor, who can't even afford this land, and majority of this population are those who are producing the food we eat.
There have been a lot of debate regarding the 1978 Land Use Act, and I think the debates and the discussions started right even after the enactment of the act. And I think these challenges and these issues will continue to dominate the space and will continue to attract a lot of academic and practitioner interest in the forthcoming years. So it's very important to look into the act and then try to make it a functional and living act that will respond to the emerging needs of our society and our communities. But just to say that commercialization of agriculture, which we are all advocating, cannot happen without collective or without collectivization of landholdings. So there must be aggregation of smallholder landholdings into bigger enterprises for commercial production to take place. And again, we have been talking a lot about some of these issues of land grab and land grabbing. Happily, it's still at a very low level in Nigeria, but in the forthcoming years, it will become a huge challenge. Mm-hmm. How do we overcome this? Like I often say, we have to overcome this through building the capacities of our smallholder farmers, enabling them to form mega cooperatives, enabling them to aggregate their land holdings into bigger enterprises, giving them capacity to work together, to share profits and interest from their own investment. And I think this is the way to go. So that will not be a huge challenge if we're able to address the human capacity gaps that we currently have, and we're able to help the smallholder farmers to organize themselves into mega cooperative groups that will be able to engage in large-scale commercial farming, profitable for the Nigerian market, and with capacity to access the vast opportunities that exist in the international market.
All right. I want to hear your view about in relation to climate change, its impacts or effects in the rising insecurity that we're witnessing. And then recently, I think 2 months ago, we had flooding that wiped out the majority of some farms, some hectares of land, farmlands somewhere. So I think Kebbi and some other states like that. What exactly? What's your view on that, on climate change and insecurity generally?
Thank you very much. Like you rightly say, a lot of our farmers this year have lost thousands of hectares of land and hundreds of thousands of metrics of yield due to flooding in so many states across the country. In fact, states like Imo that really witnessed flooding have witnessed massive flooding this year. So this is to show that climate change is a huge and a great challenge for us to adapt to. Again, if we look at some parts of the Southwest, there was a lot of dry spells that resulted to the drying of crops, while other areas were witnessing excess rainfall and floods. Other areas had dry spells that affected yields. And what we have to do is to focus on adaptive strategies. How do we make our farming system resilient to some of these challenges? And what kind of technology and interventions do we have to put in place? How do we manage flow of water into the major river systems? How do we regulate that flows in such a way that we will be able to mitigate the extent of flooding? And in areas where we witness dry spells, how do we develop capacities of farmers, both smallholder and large-scale farmers, to develop water harvesting techniques, water conservation techniques that are available all over the world in order to conserve moisture that is needed for the growth of crops and the watering of our animals. So again, it boils back to policy. I'm happy the Federal Ministry of Environment has put up a lot of mechanisms and has keyed into many of the global initiatives at mitigating the impact of climate. But I strongly advocate for increased capacity for farmers to be able to adapt climate smart agricultural practices, and for our research institutions, coordinated by the Agricultural Research Council of Nigeria, as in collaboration with many of the international agricultural research institutions, to come up with various crop varieties that will be able to withstand some of these changing climatic conditions.
It's well established that there is a link between food insecurity and rising conflict. But do you think there's this rise in food prices in the market? Do you think the increase, like I mentioned earlier, 22.6 million Nigerians are said to be food insecure? Do you think this increase has anything to do with rising insecurity in the country? Do you think there's a link between hunger and insecurity?
For sure, there is a strong link, like we have seen in Zamfara state, like we have seen in the states of Borno and Yobe, like we have seen in some parts of Benue, some parts of Nasarawa, where some of these conflicts are imminent, like we have seen in the previous years in Plateau and parts of Kaduna state, where conflicts were prominent at certain points in time. There is direct link, and not only in Nigeria, but globally. Secondly, there are basically 2 to 3 causes of food deficiency or food inadequacy. First, it could be due to low yields or inadequate harvest in some, as we do witness some of the times. Secondly, it could be logistics, excess food in one part and then less food in another part because of the challenges of logistics in terms of moving food from one part of the country to the other, from one part of the state to another. Or thirdly, it could be due to poverty. Despite the availability of food, I cannot access the food because I don't have the means to pay for the food. So these are the factors that aggravate it. So poverty has direct link to food shortage. So overall, if you look at in Nigeria, rarely can you go to any market looking for whatever quantity of food and then you don't see the food. So the food is there, it's available, but the challenge is the affordability.
Yeah.
And this again boils back not only to the government, but also to the private sector and well-spirited Nigerians to invest heavily in job creation, to invest heavily on the youths, and to invest heavily in providing opportunities for work where people will go and work and a decent wage and be able to buy food, to buy other essentials of life that they require. And I think the government at all levels, state, federal, and local governments, need to give more prominence in building the capacities of young people and giving them the enabling capacity and environment to be able to pursue productive occupations.
Okay. Within the next 5 minutes, no doubt military measures and government policies to some extent helps in managing conflict. But from your studies and findings so far, what do you think are these alternatives or sustainable ways of ensuring lasting peace? Because most of what we've had so far is like a blanket cover. Something will happen and then we react to it. What are the sustainable ways we can have lasting peace in most of these conflict environments?
Basically, is to ensure in the first place that the citizens are engaged.
Okay.
Citizens must be engaged. Citizens must be given the right to participate in the governance, in security, and contribute immensely in this respect. The security establishments must recognize and acknowledge their capacity and their limitations. Where they are limited and where their capacity is limited, they should openly engage citizens and allow citizens to contribute and support them in securing insecure areas. But what is most fundamental is that they must ensure fairness, justice, and accountability. Like we have seen in many other places, some security establishments disrespect community institutions and community leadership, and they do not see much value in working with people. Or in other situations, they succumb themselves to pressures from certain interests, from certain community groups, and commit atrocities against other communities or other community groups. This must not be allowed. The justice system and the political leadership must take charge and ensure that the security agencies are doing what is right within the provisions of the constitutions and, like they popularly say, within the limits of their operational guidelines. This will give citizens confidence in working with the security establishments, since we have inadequate security personnel in the country to secure our urban and our rural communities.
Okay. I don't know if this recommendations is in line with your, I know PARI has done extensive work, like I said earlier. From your findings so far, what will you recommend for resolving or mitigating this constant clashes between farmers and herders, and now this current issue we're having with banditry? What are your recommendations, or how do we manage this?
For me, fundamentally, the first one is capacity. Capacity for the security agencies, capacity for the civil servant, and capacity for all of those actors involved in the process. Their ability to analyze the situation and understand it in its correct context, profile the actors and understand the role every actor is playing, and to appropriately respond is the first foundation for success. But the way security establishments are just deployed to an area with little briefing and thinking that they will solve all the problem on their own will never work.
Yeah.
And I think this has significantly contributed in escalating farmer-herder conflicts, in escalating these challenges of banditry and other things. Importantly, the Nigerian intelligence service must be at the top of the situation and must do their work. They must unravel the sources of the drugs that is driving the bandits. They must unravel the sources of weapons that are used by the bandits. And these sources must be blocked, and blocked effectively.
Yeah.
The third point is that we all know and we all understand that the vast majority of resources collected by bandits do not remain in the bushes, because most of the bandits in the rural areas are just serving as foot soldiers to some key leaders of the bandits who are mostly urban-based and who live with us in the cities, who generate all the intelligence and who share it with the bandits and who gives them direction, who organize the repatriation of the money that is collected at ransom, who organize the trade in drugs and arms. So once we do this and we are able to unravel the people on the marks behind this crime, we will significantly address the challenge. And this is the work of Nigeria's intelligence agencies. And then finally, all of us, including the media, must rise up and become patriotic citizens, not only engage in criticizing government blindly, but rather in taking a consultative and an engagement process that will give every other person the confidence to come openly and contribute, whether you are in the opposition or you are in government, whether you are in the media or you are in the judiciary or you are in the civil society, whether you are a community leader or a religious leader. All of this blame game will take us to nowhere. So let's stop the blame game. Let's cooperate like the bandits and criminals are cooperating, and let's face them squarely as citizens of Nigeria.
All right, thank you so much for that. There is one question here from Danjuma Mohammed. You just use 1 minute to answer the question so that we can close for the session. His question is, I think trust has been eroded in our communities. Do you think if peace agencies focus more on vertical cohesion between herder and farmer communities, this will bring lasting peace in our society? Just 1 minute so that we can close.
Strongly agree with him.
Yeah.
And it is this sort of collaboration that has restored substantial parts of Plateau State to peaceful coexistence. It is this engagement in peace building and engagement and confidence building across socio-economic divides, across ethnic divides, across religious divides that has brought a lot of peace and stability in southern parts of Kaduna, that has brought peace in most parts of Nasarawa, Taraba, and Benue states. And this is one of the key ways or important ways to go.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Salim Omali, for joining me today. And on that note, we'll have to close the session for today and hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.